We've talked about a lot of problems. Today we're going to talk about one of the most difficult and intractable problems in the modern world. It's the problem of the Middle East. I'd like to talk to you about this problem and give some retrospect. Why did we get into this problem? And then I'd like to end with some suggestions for solutions. Let's begin with the difficulty of the Middle East, and it has to do with the two religions. They both have different views of history, and it is a land that is tied to history. They both have ancient claims to the land. They both believe that they have rights to the land, sometimes those rights given by God. And the Jews and the Palestinians do not agree on what they think is the history that led them to where they are. Let's begin with the beginning of both groups. Abraham. When Abraham was commanded by God to go and sacrifice his son, the scriptures of the Jews clearly say that he went to the land of Moriah, and there on a hill, on a mount, he brought his son, Isaac, up to be sacrificed. And he would have sacrificed Isaac, except that God stopped it with an angel. The scriptures of the Muslims, on the other hand, state that Abraham went to Moriah not with Isaac, but rather with his older son, Ishmael. And similarly, the sacrifice of Ishmael was stopped by a divine intervention through an angel. So the story is the same, but the concept is that in one case, Ishmael was the son, and in the other case, Isaac was the son. Well, if these two groups disagree on the very fundamental of the formation of their ethnic groups, surely they disagree on other points of history as well. And that is, of course, the case. Because these events occurred in Jerusalem, both Muslims and Jews claim Jerusalem as very special territory that should be under their control. In the case of the Jews, of course, it is the most important place on earth. In the case of the Muslims, it is the third most important place on earth, but still very, very important. There was some cooperation on the ownership of the land, not ownership, but on the administration of the Temple Mount. But one day, one of the Jewish radical leaders, Ariel Sharon, took a group of armed men up onto the Temple Mount, or as the Muslims call it, the Noble Sanctuary. And there, in full view of the Muslims, they paraded around and looked over the edge and generally incited Muslim response. That became a serious problem and kicked off the latest round of difficulties between the Muslims and the Jews. Now, as we begin this story of the Middle East, I want to tell you a story that was given to me by one of my former students. His name is Raed Al-Zubi, and here we see a picture of Raed and his wife, Rima, and their first little child. Raed is Jordanian, and he is a Muslim. He is a practicing Muslim, and he is quite faithful. He graduated with a Master of Science degree and then later a PhD from BYU. He has remained close to my family. He calls me Dad. He insisted that I go to his wedding, which my wife and I were happy to do. He often still consults with me, and we talk about the Middle East often. And in one of our discussions, he sent me this story. He is, by the way, a general manager of a plastics company in Dubai. He told me the story of a disappointed salesman of a cola company who returned from his Middle East assignment when a friend asked him, "Why weren't you successful with the Arabs, the salesman was disappointed, as I mentioned. The salesman explained, "When I got posted into the Middle East, I was very confident that I would make a good sales pitch, as cola is virtually unknown there. But I had a problem. I didn't speak Arabic. So I planned to convey the message through 3 posters. And here we see the first poster, a man lying hot in the desert sand, totally exhausted and fainting. The second poster, the man is drinking our cola. And in the third, the man is totally refreshed." And then these posters were pasted all over the place. "Then that should have worked," said the friend. "It should have," said the salesman, "but I didn't realize that Arabs read from right to left." A difficult problem indeed. Let's talk about some of the words that we may encounter as we discuss the Middle East. One of those words is jihad. Jihad means suffering or struggle. In some people's minds, it means a struggle against one's personal desires or appetites or evil forces that come into a person's personal self. When that happens, when viewed in those terms, jihad is roughly like repentance. It's a struggle of maintaining one's self pure before God. The other meaning of jihad is a broad-based Islam-wide meaning, and it is protection against Islam in the face of invasion or some force trying to overcome Islam. If it is national in that sense, or religion-wide, the people must unite in war and follow Allah's will, but they must not kill innocents. Regardless, terrorism today is breaking both of those meanings of jihad. But there are people within Islam who believe that jihad should be practiced as it is being done because they say it is necessary in order to save Islam. These are the people, and I will call them the radical Muslims, that must be dealt with in whatever plan we have. Let's talk about fairly recent history. Let's begin with the 19th century. At that time, the Arabic states were under the control of the Ottoman Empire. They were more or less possessions of the Ottomans, if you like. They were colonies of the Ottomans. Then in World War I, when the Ottomans entered into the war on the side of Germany and Austria, Great Britain felt free to attack the Ottomans. And they sent a young army officer named Lawrence into Arabia, where he talked with the leader of one of the major tribes who was living in Mecca. He was called the Sharif. He talked with this leader, and the leader suggested that there could be some cooperation. The cooperation would be that the leader's sons would raise an army, and that army would fight alongside the British, and they would work to destroy the Ottoman Empire's forces in the Arabian Peninsula and along through the Middle East in the areas of Palestine and Syria. That occurred. A joint army was formed, and joint battles were fought. Not necessarily the British army fighting alongside the Arabic army, but they fought in tandem, some miles apart, but proceeding equally up through the Middle East toward Syria. It was all done with the understanding that there would be a new Arabic state created at the end of the war. The defeat of the Ottomans was effective, and it accelerated the end of World War I. But during World War I, the British had another important force that came upon them by way of the need for money and support from the Jews. Because of this need, the foreign minister wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, a very prominent Jew in Europe, head of banks. And this is the letter. It's called the Balfour Declaration, after the British Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour, Foreign Secretary. Notice that it says the Jews can gather to Palestine, but that the rights of those living in Palestine, that is the Palestinians, should not be violated. This declaration proved to be unworkable. Initially, the Arabs felt that they should be given a new Arab territory in which they controlled the lands of their birth outside or within the Middle East. But following World War I, Britain and France refused to give the Arabs the land that they had promised. Britain took some areas as protectorates, and France took others. The family was of the Sharif of Mecca was not given the positions that they had been promised. To make matters worse, another tribe, the Saudis, were backed in their unification of the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, and therefore they took possession of all of Arabia, in essence dividing the Arabs into two or perhaps more armed camps. There was some measure of political power given to the sons of the Sharif. Eventually, they were installed as kings in Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. Those areas were still under British and French influence, and so these kings were viewed as little more than puppets. That caused dissatisfaction. And in Iraq and Syria, there were internal rebellions, the kings were overthrown, and radical regimes were established. In Transjordan, which later became known as Jordan, the king was assassinated, but the revolt failed as the king's grandson assumed the leadership and maintained control. In the land called Palestine, the British decided that they would establish neither a king nor any kind of a transition government, but would keep possession of that land for itself. So here we see what happened at the end of World War I, with Syria and Lebanon being given to France as protectorates, Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine being given to Britain as protectorates, and then those areas eventually becoming independent or semi-independent, except for Palestine. And Palestine remained, throughout this entire period, a possession of Great Britain. The Jewish people at this time were quite anxious to begin emigration to Palestine. There had already been a movement called Zionism, begun in the 1800s, that allowed a few people to go back to Palestine, and those people bought land from the Palestinians and settled in a normal way. It was generally Jewish migration that was simply protected by Great Britain. These Jews formed kibbutz, that is, socialist collective farms, and they lived quite prosperously in the land administered by the Palestinians under the control of the British. Migration was halted during World War II, except for a few refugees. Then, during that period, the Holocaust occurred. And when that occurred, world opinion toward the Jewish people changed. The Jews needed a place to go, and that place to go was assumed to be Palestine. The British became alarmed because after World War II, thousands of Jews wanted to flood into Palestine. And the Palestinians were alarmed, and therefore the British were also alarmed. So the British attempted to stop these people from coming in, the Israelis from coming in. But the Israelis organized themselves into a terrorist community, or at least part of the Israelis did, and they started to blow up sites that were owned by the British. One of the worst of those attacks was at the King David Hotel, where many innocent victims were killed because of this Jewish terrorist attack. Britain withdrew from Palestine and turned the problem over to the United Nations, hoping that somehow the United Nations would be able to solve the problem. The United Nations accepted the problem, and there were really two different choices. One was that the area should be ruled by the Palestinians. If that was the case, it would be favoring majority rule. And the Jewish population, or the Israelis, as they came to be called, would be under the control of the Palestinians. The second is that the Jews should be given a homeland. That, of course, is the position favored by Charity because of the Holocaust and the victim status of the Jews. And therefore, because of that conflict, the United Nations was divided. Eventually, the people within the United Nations agreed that the United States would make the decision, and whichever way the United States chose, other nations would follow their lead. President Truman consulted his wife, and she said that majority rule should be the choice. She was, admittedly, a little bit anti-Semitic. But Truman chose exactly the opposite side. He decided that charity would be more important than majority rule, and therefore he signed, he said that the United States would vote in favor of partition. Here is a map that shows essentially how it was to be divided. There was to be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. They were to touch at 2 or 3 key areas, but in essence they were to be administered separately. Jerusalem was to be an international zone administered by the United Nations. Upon the declaration of the United Nations that there would be a partition, war broke out immediately. The Arabs refused to accept this. They believed that land was being taken from them unjustly, and they did not believe in the charity for the Jews. As a result, there was serious confrontation. The United States entered the war on the side of the Jews, and when that happened, thousands, perhaps millions of Palestinians fled into exile. They became the refugees of that century. There were a series of other wars between the Palestinians and the Israelis. In each case, the Israelis were successful in exerting their power, and they gained more and more territory. They were backed by the United States in each of these successful engagements. Eventually, it led to Israel militarily occupying all of the area west of the Jordan River. So they had not only the territory that was assigned to them by the partition, but they also occupied the territory that was assigned to Palestine in the partition. And then, little by little, the Jewish or the Israeli people expanded their territory to include an ever greater region within that area of Palestinian mandate. The Palestinians had almost no power to resist. But eventually, under some negotiating pressure from the United States, there was an agreement reached where each of the entities would have their own territory. The Palestinians would be given their own land, somewhat reduced, and the Jews or Israelis would be given their territory, somewhat enlarged. Today, there are some additional problems. Look at this map. We can see that within the green area designated as Palestinian territory, there are little triangles, each of those representing a village of occupation by the Israelis. The Israelis have taken possession of these little villages because they represent strategic areas that they claim for defense. On the other hand, it is believed by many Israelis that they should control all of the land, and therefore these villages are seen by Israelis, some Israelis at least, as a precursor to pushing the Palestinians completely out of the territory. They may allow the Palestinians to continue to occupy their lands, but they would all come under control of the Israelis. That's the way it is today, except that some of the Palestinians have some control over the areas that are most important for Palestinian control because there are more Palestinians living there. And that group that controls that is called the Palestinian Authority. There is a wall that the Israelis are building and have largely completed that separates the Palestinian territories from the Israeli territories. That wall zigzags in and out, capturing as many of the little enclaves of Israeli camps as possible. It is clear that the Israelis are anticipating that they will continue to occupy those camps. The Palestinians, in ongoing peace negotiations, want the Israelis to withdraw from those camps, but the Israelis refuse. Then came 9/11, and the problem of the Middle East came to the United States in a very dramatic way. Resentment against the United States was common throughout the Islamic world. Resentment because of the ongoing Palestinian problem, but also resentment because the United States seemed to ignore the Arabs in many decisions. And there were lots of problems with fundamental Arabs who still believed that jihad was an important part of their lives. The LDS belief, I think, was characterized by what the First Presidency said. They identified Muhammad as an inspired man, just as they identified Martin Luther and other people in the Protestant Reformation as inspired. The church saw that Muhammad had raised the level of spirituality among the Arab people. Some believe that Muhammad's teachings were perhaps changed to reflect a more belligerent attitude or to ignore some of the truths that a prophet should have been told from an LDS point of view. There are, in fact, two scriptural areas for Islam. One of them is their holy book, the Quran. Another is a book of practices of less importance than the Quran, but of still high importance within the Islamic community. It's called the Hadith. Many people believe that the Hadith grew up over time and was not purely the words of the Prophet Muhammad. And therefore, it's impossible to tell whether or not Muhammad was truly a prophet, having the truth and giving it to his people, or perhaps he only gave part of the truth because the people would only accept part of the doctrine. Now let's talk about rights. Who does the land belong to? Were the Jews entitled to the land as part of the promise of Abraham? And here we see a map of all of the tribes. And notice that the tribes actually occupy territory on both sides of the Jordan River. The Book of Mormon gives us some clues as to who has the rights to the land. In 3 Nephi, chapter 20, verse 29, it says, "And I will remember the covenant which I have made with my people, the Jews, And I have covenanted with them that I would gather them together in mine own due time, that I would give unto them again the land of their fathers for their inheritance, which is the land of Jerusalem, which is the promised land unto them forever, saith the Father. The land of Jerusalem is, in this context, the larger territory, perhaps encompassing all of the land promised to the 12 tribes. But what was in the Lord's good time? What were the conditions that God would give this land to the Jews? In 3rd Nephi, in chapter 20, verses 30 to 34, it says, And it shall come to pass that the time cometh when the fullness of my gospel shall be preached unto them, the Jews. And they shall believe in me, that I am Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and shall pray unto me, the Father, in my name. Then shall their watchmen lift up their voice, and with the voice together shall they sing, for they shall see eye to eye. Then will the Father gather them together again, and give unto them Jerusalem for the land of their inheritance. So when will they receive the land? After they have been converted to a knowledge of Jesus Christ. And if the Jews would have waited until after they had a knowledge of Jesus Christ, what would have been the effect in the land of Palestine? Would there not have been better cooperation between the Palestinians and the Israelis? Would there not have been at least greater attempts at peace? I think so. But that didn't happen, did it? We might also ask ourselves, with such a rich heritage, why aren't Muslims playing a major role in culture today? They have had a tremendous backing throughout the history of the world. So let's ask those questions. Case number one, they are, but we are not aware of their contributions. Case number two, Muslims have different values. Case number three, they've been dominated by the Turks and others, perhaps the British, and therefore they were unable to exercise that dominion. And case number four, Muslims, because of their culture, missed the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, but have now begun to see the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, we can see perhaps a change in Islam, a change in which they are starting to feel the need for freedom as espoused during the Industrial Revolution and even more the Enlightenment. And perhaps that will cause a change in those countries. They have been, after all, largely totalitarian. So how do we bring peace to the Middle East? The first step is that we must recognize that Israel must take the first step because they have the power. Step number one, establish Palestine as a sovereign country. They are almost at this step now. The Israelis have the power. They can give autonomy to Palestine. They can allow the state of Palestine to be formed, and a tremendous pressure against Israel and the United States would be relieved with just that simple step. Moderate Israelis must step forward to do that. But that's difficult because within Israel, there are radical groups who refuse to compromise in that way. These are the groups who write Arabs to the gas chambers on the walls of Israel. Step number two, the United States and Israel must support moderate Arab states as a model for Palestinians and others. That probably includes supporting those states that are currently agitating for freedom. Let's hope that in Libya and Syria and in other places in the Middle East, moderate forces of democratic bent will come into power. It also means that Fatah and Hamas, the two rival groups within the Palestinian community, must stop fighting each other, and the moderates within those groups must take charge. Third, The Israelis must realize that they are bullies. They have to stop treating the Palestinians as bullies are treating those who are under them. The Israelis must stop taking actions that inflame brutality in response to terrorism, destructions of homes just by association, and then not giving the right to reconstruct the home. Economic subjugation, dominance of the water and other important natural resources. They must stop settling in Palestinian areas and give Palestine truly its independence as a nation. And they must stop refusing to let refugees return. There are thousands, perhaps millions of Palestinian refugees, some of whom would like to return. They ought to at least be given that opportunity. The Palestinians must also change their mind. They must stop acting like terrorists. They must stop doing things that inflame the rest of the world, and especially the Jews. They must stop terrorism, and the majority of people in the Palestinian community, as well as the surrounding Arab states, must renounce terrorism once and for all, and finally with a strong renunciation. And they must restrict, stop, and crush groups that refuse to renounce terrorism, like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and many of the other areas within the Islamic community that continue to fund terrorism. There must be a recognition that Muslims, especially Arabs, are struggling with prejudice throughout the world, and that they will continue to integrate into Western countries. Therefore, we must relieve that Muslim frustration at the current situation in the world by giving aid and respect to the Muslim people and Muslim nations. We must learn about Islam, compare our feelings of Islam to perhaps the feelings that existed toward the Jews before World War II. We must respect Arabic culture and its accomplishments and support Arabic freedom. In addition to that, we must initiate programs that change attitudes. Fundamentally, there has got to be an attitudinal change among the Arabs, among the Palestinians and the Jews, and among those who support the Palestinians in the Arab community and those who support the Jews in Western civilization. I'd like to give you an example of a story that talks about this change in attitude. I call it the Armenian story. Remember that Armenia was an area historically in the eastern part of what is today Turkey. At the beginning of World War I, the Armenians, Christians from many, many centuries before, were thought to be a threat to the Turks because of their co-religion with the Russians. Therefore, the Turks decided that they would eliminate the Armenians, and they entered into some of the worst possible genocides that the world has ever seen. In the course of the Armenian atrocities, a young woman and her brother were pursued down the street by a Turkish soldier. Cornered in an angle of the wall, and the brother was slain before his sister's eyes. She dodged down an alley, leaped a wall, and escaped. Later, being a nurse, she was forced by the Turkish authorities to work in the military hospital. Into her ward was brought one day the same Turkish soldier who had slain her brother. He was very ill. A slight inattention would ensure his death. The young woman, now safe in America, confesses to the bitter struggle that took place in her mind. The old Adam cried vengeance, and the new Christ cried love. The better side of her conquered, and she nursed him as carefully as any other patient in the ward. The recognition had been mutual, and one day, unable to restrain his curiosity, the Turk asked the nurse why she had not let him die. And when she replied, "I am a follower of him who said, 'Love your enemies and do them good,'" he was silent for a long time. At last he spoke. "I never knew that there was such a religion. If that is your religion, tell me more about it, for I want it." Religion is the problem in the Middle East, but it may be the solution as well. I'm not suggesting that the Jews become Christians or that the Muslims become Christians. What I am suggesting is that they both understand a principle taught by Christ, maybe also taught by Muslim and Jewish leaders as well. And that principle is the principle of love and trust and forgiveness. They must somehow grow together. Both sides must forgive and remember, and here's an interesting little statement that I think summarizes well what needs to be done. Forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. The region is historically important, and they love their history, but they cannot make it better by continuing the fight today. Here's a little document that I have prepared, a slideshow on Jerusalem. It gives some of the message that I would like you to remember as a method for changing the situation in the Middle East.
Jerusalem, Jerusalem, all roads lead to you. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, your light is shining through, and you will show the way to all who see it shine, that we can live in peace in Jerusalem this time. The walls will keep you in, the walls will keep you out, the gates are calling those who know what it's about. In Jerusalem, Jerusalem, all roads lead to you. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, your light is shining through, and you will show the way to all who see it shine, that we can live in peace in Jerusalem this time. Jerusalem is old, Jerusalem is new, Jerusalem can hold Muslim, Christian, Jew. In Jerusalem, Jerusalem, all roads lead to you. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, your light is shining through, and you will show the way to all who see it shine, that we can live in peace in Jerusalem this time. Markets and the alleys, the temples and the tombs, a place for all believers. It has so many rooms in Jerusalem, Jerusalem, all roads lead to you. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, your light is shining through, and you will show the way to all who see it shine, that we can live in peace in Jerusalem this time. Yes, we can live in peace in Jerusalem this time.
I hope you enjoyed it. May God bless us to understand the Middle East. Thank you.